There are many safety measures water utility workers take to protect themselves on the job site. The most obvious are those requiring the use of standard personal protective equipment, such as hard hats, safety glasses, and safety shoes. But it's also important for workers to protect themselves from a less obvious risk in the workplace: the occupational exposure to bloodborne diseases.
Bloodborne pathogens are microorganisms such as viruses or bacteria that are carried in blood and can cause disease in people. In the United States, approximately 300,000 people are infected with the hepatitis B virus, also known as HBV, annually, and about 35,000 are infected with the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. Many people may not even know they're infected and can carry the disease for many years while looking and feeling healthy. However, their blood and other body fluids may be highly contagious, so they may unknowingly spread the disease to others. Generally speaking, the likelihood of exposure to infectious blood is fairly low in the utility industry, but an accidental needle stick, contaminants on a work surface, or the performance of first aid can result in exposure to a coworker's blood or other body fluids. Transmission of the disease will generally occur by exposure of unprotected skin, especially if the skin has open cuts or sores, to infected blood or body fluids. The accidental penetration of the skin by a contaminated sharp object such as a hypodermic needle, sexual contact, or by the exposure of the mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, or mouth to infected blood or other body fluids. OSHA's bloodborne pathogens regulation applies to all persons who may reasonably anticipate contact with blood or other potentially infectious materials in the course of their employment.
The focus of the regulation is the creation of a written exposure control plan, which describes how the employer will protect the employees from exposure. This type of plan mandates engineering controls, work practices, personal protective equipment, HBV vaccinations, and training.
The plan includes an exposure determination and listing of all jobs in which employees will or may occasionally be exposed to potentially infectious materials on the job. In the water utility field, that list primarily includes meter readers, custodial positions, laundry worker jobs, lab workers, and other employees who work with sharp objects, breakable glass, or tools that might pierce the skin and cause bleeding, construction or repair crews working in close proximity to sewer lines, and any employees who might participate in first aid procedures following a workplace accident. It's important to know a little bit about the two bloodborne pathogens of most concern on the job site: HBV and HIV. Hepatitis B is a highly infectious virus that infects the liver and is transmitted primarily through blood-to-blood contact. HBV initially causes inflammation of the liver, but it can lead to more serious conditions such as cirrhosis and liver cancer. There is no cure or specific treatment for HBV, but many people will develop antibodies which help them get over the infection. Hepatitis B, or HBV, poses a risk because the virus is so durable. HIV is the virus that causes acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. By killing or damaging cells of a body's immune system, HIV progressively destroys a body's ability to fight infections and certain cancers. The virus often attacks a person's brain and lymph nodes. As mentioned earlier, infection may not be apparent for several years, but eventually HIV causes an acute illness with flu-like symptoms.
The best way for water utility workers to protect themselves from the possibility of exposure to bloodborne pathogens is to follow a policy of universal precautions and safe work practices. Universal precautions means assuming that all blood and body fluids are infectious. There are a number of safe work practices that may be considered depending on the particular utility and setting. For example, practices as basic as washing your hands with soap and water.
Facilities with soap and water for cleaning hands, other skin, and mucous membranes should be readily accessible to employees immediately or as soon as feasible after removal of gloves or other personal protective equipment. If hand washing is not available, then an appropriate hand cleanser or antiseptic towelette may be used. It's important for employees to be especially alert and careful around washroom and locker room facilities in a utility, as it's possible they contain razors, needles used to administer personal medications, and contaminated surfaces. If blood or any possible body fluid is found anywhere in the workplace, the area should be cleaned immediately with a 10% Clorox solution by a person wearing appropriate protective wear. The material should be disposed of in a labeled, designated hazardous waste container. If an unknown or possibly contaminated material splashes into your eyes, use the nearest emergency eye wash to flush them thoroughly. Broken glass should not be handled directly by hand, but should be removed by mechanical means such as a brush and dustpan, tongs, or forceps, and immediately placed in a designated waste container. Eating, drinking, smoking, applying cosmetics or lip balm, or handling contact lenses is prohibited in water utility labs or any work area where there is a reasonable likelihood of occupational exposure. Do not store food and drink in laboratory refrigerators, freezers, or shelves where potentially infectious materials are present. Sharp's disposable containers should be readily available to place needles, razors, and various sharp objects or cutting tools for disposal. These containers should be puncture-resistant, leak-proof, and closable. The Bloodborne Pathogens regulation states that containers must be either properly labeled or color-coded. Because contaminated material might inadvertently be placed in regular trash bins, never crush or compress trash or disposal material that could contain sharp or contaminated objects. Inspect and decontaminate on a regular basis reusable receptacles such as bins, pails, and trash cans that have a likelihood for becoming contaminated. When contamination is visible, clean and decontaminate receptacles immediately. Stay clear of sharp metal or broken glass that might have blood traces on them. When blood is discovered on a work surface, it should be removed and the surface disinfected with a Clorox solution immediately. Gloves used for this or any handling of potentially contaminated material should be removed and disposed of properly. Be especially careful not to rub your eyes or touch your face with gloves while wearing them. To properly remove gloves, insert your finger inside the other glove or grab the bottom of the glove and turn it inside out, avoiding contact with skin or clothes. Immediately wash your hands following glove removal. Always change gloves between jobs or duties while in the possible presence of contamination. Never wash or decontaminate disposable gloves for reuse. Utility gloves may be decontaminated for reuse if the integrity of the glove is not compromised. However, they must be discarded if they are cracked, peeling, torn, punctured, or exhibit other signs of deterioration, or when their ability to function as a barrier is compromised. Remove masks and glasses in a similar manner by touching the inside surface only to avoid contact with skin and clothes. Gowns, aprons, and other protective clothing should be worn when there is possible exposure of contaminated materials to the head, feet, or clothing.
One of the most likely sources of exposure to bloodborne pathogens at a utility may come when you least expect it, when a coworker is bleeding and in need of first aid. Of course, you should call 911 and summon professional help, but in some cases you may need to help remove the coworker from further danger, and that's when you're putting yourself at risk.
Utility first aid equipment should include universal precaution, PPE, such as appropriate safety gloves, apron, face shield, and glasses for use when assisting with first aid. Take the time to put them on to protect yourself first. A special CPR mouthpiece should be used when CPR is given. These mouthpieces have a one-way valve to prevent contamination from the victim. Once emergency workers have arrived on the scene to take over first aid, immediately remove your gloves and glasses and wash any exposed body surfaces with soap and water.
If your clothing has a victim's blood on it, carefully remove it as well. Report the incident and any possible exposure to a supervisor. It may be necessary for tests of you and the victim to be conducted to make sure bloodborne pathogens have not been transmitted. As with so many aspects of our safety procedures in a water utility, a key component is the training of new workers and ongoing training of existing workers, which is probably why you're watching this video right now. But there's much more to the training program.
Training sessions should include an explanation of the context of the OSHA Bloodborne Pathogens Standard and information on how a copy of the standard may be obtained. Also, a review of the utility's exposure control plan and how a copy of it may be obtained. Training should include a general explanation of the epidemiology and symptoms of bloodborne diseases and an explanation of how the disease is transmitted.
Employees should be informed on what the utility is doing in regards to controlling bloodborne pathogens, including engineering controls, work practices, and personal protective equipment, as well as information on the appropriate actions and procedures to follow if an exposure occurs. Training sessions should include information on the types, proper use, location, removal, handling, and disposal of personal protective equipment, and an explanation of the signs and labels required by the standard. The exposure control plan shall be reviewed and updated at least annually and whenever necessary to reflect new or modified tasks and procedures which affect occupational exposure and to reflect new or revised employee positions with occupational exposure. OSHA's Bloodborne Pathogens regulation requires that the employer shall make available the hepatitis B vaccine and vaccination series to all employees who have occupational exposure and post-exposure evaluation, and follow up to all employees who have had an exposure incident. This section of the regulation should be reviewed with employees so they understand how it applies in the course of their job duties. Once employees receive the appropriate training, HBV vaccinations should be made available to those who run the risk of exposure. As mentioned earlier, the likelihood of exposure to infectious blood is fairly low in the utility industry, but it's a risk that should be taken seriously. By utilizing universal precautions and treating any exposure to blood and bodily fluids as if they are contaminated, utility employees will be able to protect themselves and others from this danger.